Welcome, TRP online viewers. Thank you for carving out a little portion of your day to learn with us. For our in-person folks, last week was our first week back in Asbury's sanctuary for at least a few months. And I thought that our move, that shift, provided a welcomed break from our sermon series on the story of Joseph. Our in-person crowd is usually pretty different from our online crowd. So a week off would give our in-person crowd a chance to get caught up on the past 5 weeks of teachings on Joseph, whether it be on YouTube or on our website. It's been good. It's been a good series, if I say so myself. A little bit biased, but that's okay. There's been a lot of poignant questions of the text, of ourselves, and of God, too. So if you've missed it, I would encourage you to go check it out. Anyway, in its place, I wanted to do some reflecting, and I'd like to include you in this as well. We can think of this as less of a sermon and more of a spiritual exercise or an examen of sorts that hopefully will help us to reflect on who we are, where we've come from, and where we're going. And here's the impetus of my thinking. I was asked almost 2 years ago now to contribute an essay on planting a church in a rural context for a friend of mine who's writing a book. Salisbury, as you know, is a weird combination of rural and urban-ish, urban light sort of a setting. But for the most part, I'd say a rural mindset dominates, even with the college and the hospital and some of these more city-type structures included within our town. Just for reference, I grew up on a pig farm like 15 miles away from Salisbury, so I know rural, and I helped to plant a church, so hopefully some of that comes through in this essay that I was writing. So in my submission, basically what I did was I told the story of the Restoration Project. Now, we've been around for a little over 8 years now, and whenever I think about our history, it gets me in my feelings, particularly as I reflect on the past. And the people, the partners, the leaders, the changes, the constancy, the consistency, the mistakes, the uncertainties, the growth, the loss, the hurts, the celebrations, all of these things that have become part of our history, the things that we have walked through. Now, for those of you who have been a part of that, I hope that you would agree that it's been a unique and meaningful season. For some of you, it's been the entire 8+ years, and we thank you for your partnership. Also, side note, y'all are really super weird, and I'm glad that we have found each other and created this community together. I'm very thankful for that. Before the essay goes to print, though, I was asked to add an addendum, an epilogue, something that would include some reflections on COVID, which I spent last week doing. It was a necessary addition because if anyone is out there wanting to start a church, it's a totally different world now than it was 2 years ago when I wrote this essay and 8 years ago when we started the church. There's a lot of differences that have been happened, but the pre-COVID landscape versus the mid to post-COVID landscape is very different. And as I reread my words, it just felt dated. Like anytime I alluded to being in public or not wearing sweatpants or just having fun, it hit different because we can't have fun anymore, There have certainly been changes in the church world. Now, consider this. Church attendance is absolutely not a defining metric of the success of the capital C church, nor is it really a metric of the success of a local expression of the church, although those are important numbers to consider. Nor is church attendance an accurate metric of the state of people's individual spirituality or Christian commitments. But regardless of those qualifications, a friend of mine recently posted a research article that claimed only 40 to 60% of church attenders are planning to return to their community after the pandemic, whenever that is, whatever that might mean. There's different ways of thinking about that after the pandemic. Stated differently, 40 to 60% of churchgoers are not planning to return. Clearly, for some folks, such a decision is based on convenience. It doesn't take long to develop new patterns and new habits, and staying at home has absolutely become a new pattern of life for many of us. I can't pay my kids to leave the house on most days. Now, I can bribe them with donuts and smoothies. They usually will get in the car for that, but for the most part, they just want to stick around the house and play video games and do whatever it is that they enjoy doing. They've become homebodies over the last year, and I think part of that is their awareness of COVID being out there somewhere, and some of that is just the new routines of Kate and I spending a lot more time at home. Now, and maybe some of those 40 to 60%, they're not returning to church simply because they have grown accustomed to the quarantine life. And with the massive disruption of their church routines, maybe they found that their lives are better without the obligation of church attendance. I get that. I wish it was different. I wish that churches were more compelling. I wish that churches didn't feel like obligations. And perhaps in some experiences, they aren't viewed as such. But for a lot of people, it seems like that they might be. I also wish that church wasn't such a drain sometimes, but I get that too. I volunteered in churches in the past where I would have given quite a bit for a few weeks off, or more relevant to our discussion here, a few weeks of Zoom church. So I wouldn't have to get to the space early to set up or play through a worship set or prepare a Sunday school lesson or preach a sermon. Any of these sorts of things that would have been a welcomed break. And for some folks, they feel that. It's been nice to step away from the routines and to explore something very different. It's also really hard to come back after that. Now, convenience on its own, it's not a great reason to leave the church, but it's not just that. There's other reasons too. Most obviously, the past 11 months have been tumultuous. They've been scary. They've been lonely. And we might find ourselves now nursing depression and anxiety and maybe just this pervasive and looming feeling that things will never get back to the way they were. This, too, has clearly had an impact on the choices that we have made during the last 11 months, the least of which being whether or not to attend church. I think what COVID has done is it has inspired much more fundamental questions of the human experience, of our human experience. Perhaps as we have sat in quarantine, we've considered, who am I? What do I believe? What am I doing? Am I happy? I'm hopeful that the larger church body can minister well to people who are in this place, though I know in our experience, many of us are suffering in this way too, even Susie and myself and other leaders of the church, especially for Susie. She's a really relational pastor, and not being able to be in community in the ways that we've known our entire lives for the past 11 months has done a lot to her frame of mind. What does it look like to be a minister, to be a relational minister, when the best that we have is Zoom coffee, is virtual meetings, is Zoom, which for her work is something that she has to be on all the time anyway. As I continued to think about the 40 to 60% of people not planning to come back to church, I wondered if it meant that they weren't going back to their church, in which case I'm not entirely sure this is all bad news. Perhaps this was another revelation of personal discovery for them, of who they were as individuals and who they were as a family and who they wanted to be as a follower of Jesus. It could be that attendees have found out things about their church community and its leadership over the past 11 months that have caused them to want to leave. For example, they may have learned and been troubled enough to leave due to their church's views on science, or their church's views on masks and distancing, or their church's views on when to go back to public worship gatherings and how important that is for them. Or maybe they've learned about their church's views on the inherent dignity and worth of Black lives and their church's willingness or unwillingness to speak out against injustice. Maybe they've learned about their church's views on the realities of systemic racial issues in our country, of their church's views on other forms of oppression and subjugation and discrimination and bias. I've sort of struggled with how to frame all of these in a way that would be ambiguous enough to demonstrate the fact that people have left because they now deem their church to be too liberal or not liberal enough, too progressive or not progressive enough, too political or not the right kind of political. Just from a simple scroll through Facebook, people absolutely have been learning things about their church's views on politics and what they vote for or against, and who they vote for or against, and what sort of world they envision that aligns with the call to follow Jesus. And maybe this all was troubling enough that folks have decided to leave. That's a big move, and it's a bold move. In this process, maybe we too have learned something about ourselves, about our spirituality, about our faith commitments, about who we believe Jesus is and what he is calling us to do and be in the world. For many others that are included in this 40 to 60% that may not be coming back, their questions go well beyond the views of the church. Indeed, it has moved to a reassessment on the very God that they claim to serve. Because nothing says existential crisis quite like a global pandemic. Am I right? Yeah. Nothing inspires the question, what in the world is God up to, quite like much of what we've been experiencing and much of what we have seen over this past year. This isn't just a matter of church attendance. It can be boiled down more to the individual things that we have gone through over the past 11 months, the losses that we have faced, the grief that we have not been allowed to express or to express in the ways that are traditionally known to us, the celebrations that have been stripped from us, the prayers that we feel have gone unanswered. And all of this is maybe making us reassess what we're doing. We listened to a song when we were in service on Sunday, and it has lyrics that say, we need to know that there is justice, that it will roll in abundance, and that God is building a city where we arrive as immigrants, and God calls us citizens, and God welcomes us as children home. And maybe for a lot of us, we don't have any tangible or meaningful evidence that justice will, in fact, roll in abundance, or that God is, in fact, building anything, or that God will, in fact, welcome us when we get there. Maybe what this has taught us is that all of this is just well-wishing. Maybe it just seems like it's all fairy tales, and our faith commitments have taken on a new shape over the last 11 months, which is why for some folks they don't want to go back to traditional religious gatherings because they don't hold meaning anymore. It's not just that they feel like obligations, but the very core of why these institutions exist and who they serve, that has been fractured over what we've experienced. There could be so many different reasons informing why people might be leaving the church. And let's not forget, they were leaving before the pandemic hit too. folks leaving the church is not new news, especially to people in ministry. These are the statistics that have been in front of us for years now. There's just something that's not connecting with people. And over the last 11 months, gosh, so many things may have forced people's hands. But this talk, it's not just about church attendance. Honestly, I'm not overly concerned or worried about those statistics. I am concerned and maybe worried about you, about us, about our work, not just as who fills the seats in TRP. I mean, beyond that as a metric, just who we are and how we've been weathering these storms and what that means for us. I'm concerned about our potential hypocrisy and shortcomings as a community. I'm concerned about the perception of Jesus that exists in our geographical context, in our rural, urban-ish context. I'm concerned about the perception that we might contribute to with regard to Jesus in our geographical, rural, urbanish context. I've been listening to an EP by an artist named Semler, a band named Semler. In a track called Jesus from Texas, they write, "I'll spend the rest of my life tearing down the Jesus from Texas that you put in a crown." I find that line so compelling because there are many misconceptions of who Jesus is and what Jesus is about. And over the last year especially, so many of those misconceptions have come to the fore. It's really no surprise that people are leaving the church and they're not coming back because they've been seeing how the capital C church is handling a global health crisis and racial unrest and a very divisive political election. And they're seeing how our faith in Jesus it takes expression in the world. And for a lot of people, it's just not compelling. As I consider our work here, may we be committed to tearing down these images of Jesus from Texas that others have put in a crown. So my angle here is not to get us to double down on church attendance or church commitments. I'm not trying to get more volunteers. I'm not trying to get people to sign up to be on the setup and tear down team now that we're back in Asbury and we're meeting in a physical space. That's not the point at all. In fact, many of you that are watching this, I understand your hesitancies from going back to in-person worship. And it's not just about COVID. It's not just about health issues. I know for many of you, there's this weight that we bring with us just walking under the threshold of a church, of going into the building, maybe even especially a building like Asbury with granite and marble and sacred furniture and all sorts of high churchy sorts of things that might feel so scary to you. And I get that. I'm merely just using this maybe legitimate statistic that 40 to 60% of people aren't planning to come back to church after the pandemic as a starting place for us to map what all of this has done to us, what all of the last 11 months has done to us. And I also realize that for some of you, like you feel like your life has not changed in any real tangible way. You've been going to work, your kids have been going to school perhaps, and you've had all these things that just seem to be the same. And if that's the case, there's other things around you where the world is still spinning, or maybe you feel that people aren't advancing. They're just kind of stunted and they're back here and you're over here. And we've got all these things that we're attempting to navigate. For some people, it's not just a matter of coming to terms with what's happened, but coming to terms with how to be in relationship with people who are processing all of this as well. So this, in my mind, is just a starting place for us to be thinking through all of these new issues, a starting place for us to map out what all of this has done to us, where we are as individuals with regard to our relationship with Jesus. with regard to our faith, with regard to our mental and physical health, with regard to our relationships, perhaps the strained familial relationships that we now have, where people fall on different sides of the political aisle, or the global health crisis aisle, or the vaccine aisle, or the mask wearing aisle, or any of these things that have caused a rift. I'm using these potentially legitimate statistics to help us come to terms with our contentment or lack thereof, with our hopes or lack thereof. In the last 11 months, perhaps we can sort of focus our attention on these things, not, are you going to come back to church? Who cares? Think about this instead. How have I changed? How have I grown? How do I feel? Not to get too psychoanalytical here, but just what sort of weight are you carrying right now that has been brought onto your shoulders because of what you've experienced in the last 11 months? What have you experienced in the last 11 months? What have you learned about the world and about yourself and about God? What have you seen from other Christians? What sort of acts have you seen them commit themselves to? Or what sort of thoughts have you seen demonstrated or brought to light on Facebook or social media or in real life? What have you seen from Christians, and how is that affecting you? After all of this, what do you believe now? How are you processing all of this now? This is where I've been for this entire week, as I've been writing just a few paragraphs on what church post-COVID might look like. And to be honest, I have no idea. I feel like I should be out in front of this, but I'm absolutely not, because I too am a human being that's trying to weather all of this. And I'm caught in my own questions of self-assessment, and what has this done to me and my family, and what has this done to my relationships and my faith and my beliefs? What does all of this mean? And as I've been wrestling with these concepts, and it hasn't just been this week, it's been for months now, as it's all been kind of catching up to me, I've kind of concluded that at least we know this much: the world is different now. We probably don't even understand how different it is, or what the full ramifications of this year will be. We haven't even broached the topic of economics or finances or job issues. Like, all of that is just still sort of out there somewhere. And maybe what we have found in this kind of pause, in this sort of a check-in moment, is just the legitimation of taking a pulse on where we are. So I want to leave you just with three questions to consider. And perhaps these are questions that can stick with you and you can take them where you go. I would really encourage you to take these questions into a moment of prayer and contemplation, where you begin to unpack and allow yourself to feel maybe some of the things that you haven't had time to feel, or you haven't felt the freedom to feel. Here are the three questions. How has this affected me? All of the things that we've seen and experienced, from the global pandemic to the things that are more American in our experience, the division amongst people, the politics, the successes and failures of the church, capital C. How has all of this affected me? And linked to that, how has it all affected my faith? How do I now think about God and my role in the world? And how do I think about ministering to people? And how do I think about prayer? And how do I think about my family and my relationships? And how has this all affected the beliefs that I have? I would like to pause here for a second and just allow you to hear this from me. I don't feel as though there's a predetermined right answer where you need to land here. I want to give you freedom and affirmation to allow yourself to be honest. and not to feel as though there's some sort of scripted answer that you have to arrive at, like, oh, I'm fine, everything's fine, my faith is fine, I'm good, I haven't learned too much, it's been great, whatever, I'm doing great, my family's great, my friends are great, it's all just great. I would hope that we can move beyond that and allow yourself to feel, to answer these questions, and maybe even to enunciate some things that have been on the tip of your tongue for a while, but you haven't had the courage to say out loud. I'm struggling. I don't know what I believe anymore. I don't know what God's role is in this, in the world. I don't know what to expect from God anymore. I don't know how my faith is informing my life. Perhaps these are some of the ways that you're wanting to go, but you haven't felt that freedom. How has all of this affected you, and how has all of this affected your faith? And the third question, what am I called to do in response? Some of you might not be able to answer that one quite yet. I'm hopeful that even in the midst of our existential crisis, we can still put one foot in front of the other, and we can still love our neighbor well. That's a call that we always have. And sometimes one of the most effective things that we can do in the midst of these moments of self-doubt is to serve others, because we know, regardless of our faith commitments, that is a good and noble task. We also know that that's a task that Jesus has called us to, and perhaps we can start there. In all of this, I'm just kind of anticipating and hoping that we will be able to allot time for self-reflection and maybe healing, to become more honest with where we are, to verbalize those things, to think about what we need to do, and maybe to figure out ways to move, ways in which we can begin to build ourselves back up as hopefully the world begins to get back to some version of normalcy. But consider those questions. How has all of this affected me? How has all of this affected my faith? And what am I called to do in response? I'm hopeful that spiritual examen will prove to be fruitful in your life.